Arrival in Ashford Hollow. It began, as so many calamities do, with a storm that no one saw coming. The mountains were low and soft in the distance, folded like sleeping giants beneath a winter sky when the first rider appeared at the edge of town, and by nightfall every church bell in Ashford Hollow was ringing for the dead. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The year was 1834. The place, a settlement carved from stubborn limestone and generations of superstition in the high country of eastern Kentucky. Official maps called it Ashford Hollow. It was never more than a gathering of families, a courthouse, a modest church, and a narrow mine cut deep into the ridge. But for nearly 2 decades, Ashford Hollow enjoyed what the records later called an illusion of peace. It was built, like Pine Hollow before it, on a foundation of quiet violence. The first document that survived the burning of the county archive is dated March. It describes the sudden arrival of a widowed farmer named Jonathan Whitlock, traveling from neighboring Tennessee with his 2 young daughters, Eliza and Catherine, twin girls of 9 years. The record is brief, almost apologetic, noting only that he arrived on a wagon, requested audience with the local magistrate, and carried with him a Bible wrapped in oilcloth and a ledger from his late wife's family. What no one wrote that day, but what all would later swear under oath, is that the moment the Whitlock twins stepped onto the church steps, the air grew unnaturally still. The Reverend Thomas Caldwell, pastor of Ashford Hollow's only house of worship, described it in his journal as a settling of creation, as if breath itself paused to listen. He admitted he felt uneasy, though he could not explain why. By the second day, the girls were speaking names they should never have known. According to court transcripts, Eliza and Catherine Whitlock approached Judge Albert Grayson in the early morning while their father registered a land claim. They told him they had a message from the creek bed beneath the Carter Bridge, a place no child in town had reason to visit. They described a shallow grave. They described a name, and when the sheriff rode out with 2 deputies, he found the remains of Samuel Cutter, missing since 1821, bound and weighted with stones precisely where the girls said. From there, the ledger of horrors began to unfold. Witness after witness testified that the twins spoke in calm, deliberate voices, one beginning a thought, the other finishing it without pause. They revealed names of men long presumed lost to accidents in the mines, travelers believed to have drowned, a boy blamed for running away with stolen money. Every claim the girls made proved, within days, to be true. The townspeople whispered witchcraft. The elders called for fasting and prayer. Sheriff Elias Mercer, whose own nephew's name appeared among the dead, wrote in his sworn statement, "These children do possess knowledge impossible for mortals to have. Whether heaven or hell sends it, I dare not presume." By the end of the first week, a list had been compiled, 17 names, every one of them a victim, everyone concealed beneath foundations, riverbeds, or within the sealed chambers of the Ashford Hollow mine. And beneath those names, 5 still living men, each a respected figure in the community, each implicated in theft, conspiracy, and murder stretching back more than a decade. The most damning revelation came on the evening of March. Eliza Whitlock, seated quietly in the church with her sister at her side, announced that the very beams of the sanctuary were purchased with stolen blood money, wealth taken from robbed travelers who had never reached their destination. Catherine added, with no change of expression, that the hollow itself had been founded on the promise of silence, a covenant of fear, and that those who spoke against it were made to disappear into the dark. Pastor Caldwell wrote, "I felt then that my prayers for clarity were answered not by divine comfort, but by a blade pressed to the soul. These children were not guessing, they were remembering for the dead." Jonathan Whitlock, by every account a man of sober faith and a quiet, practical nature, insisted his daughters were no witches, nor mediums, nor manipulators. "They have carried this burden since birth," he told Judge Grayson during the preliminary hearing. "Their late mother feared it. I have only feared for them, but they speak the truth. They always speak the truth." Over the next 3 days, Ashford Hollow became an open wound. Families gathered in tight clusters, neighbors eyed one another like strangers, old alliances splintered, and through it all, the Whitlock twins sat quietly with their father, speaking only when addressed, answering questions in the same gentle, unwavering cadence. By the morning of March 14, Judge Grayson ordered a full inquiry. All civic activities were suspended, church services cancelled, mining operations halted. The courthouse became both sanctuary and gallows, a place where decades of lies would be dragged into the light. But the Whitlock twins had one more warning, offered with neither drama nor cruelty, simply the calm precision of children who knew the weight of death. "The hollow is not finished," Eliza said. Catherine nodded. "Not all the guilty are old." That single statement, preserved in multiple testimonies, marked the turning of fear into terror, for it implied not only that the crimes of the past would be revealed, but that those crimes had become tradition, a cycle passed quietly from one generation to the next. The first confession. The inquiry convened at sunrise, March. A gray light poured through the courthouse windows, illuminating dust that hung in the air like the remnants of a long-held breath. There were 37 people in the room, the accused, the accusers, and those who could no longer bear the weight of silence. Jonathan Whitlock sat beside his daughters at the far end of the chamber. His hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white, his Bible laid across his lap like a sheet. Eliza leaned into Catherine, both girls pale but calm, their eyes fixed on the magistrate's table where Judge Albert Grayson presided, his silver hair combed neatly but his eyes hollow from nights without sleep. At the front of the assembly sat Elder Nathaniel Voss, one of the founding men of Ashford Hollow, a tall, spare figure with a limp that came from an old mine collapse. He had long been regarded as the settlement's moral anchor. His name had appeared third on the list provided by the twins. His face, as witnesses later described, was already the color of ash before a word had been spoken. Sheriff Elias Mercer read the first charges in a steady but subdued voice. Each name, each date, each victim was read into the record. The litany of vanished travelers sounded like a funeral roll for the forgotten. Thomas Hale, missing 1818. Jacob Lorne, vanished 1819. Samuel Cutter, found just days prior, 1821. The ledger of greed and blood stretched across 12 years. The murmurs in the courtroom were low but persistent, the sound of a community realizing it had been living inside a carefully painted lie. When the names concluded, Judge Grayson asked, "Do any of the accused wish to speak?" His voice was steady, but witnesses remembered his hand trembling as it rested on the table. For a long while silence ruled. Then Elder Voss stood, slowly, painfully, as if every joint carried the weight of what he was about to say. "I cannot carry this burden another day," he said, his voice rough, his eyes wet. "What the Whitlock girls have spoken is true, all of it, and I must tell the rest." A sound moved through the room then, a collective, almost involuntary gasp. Men shifted in their seats, women clutched their shawls tighter. The truth had cracked open, and the light was pouring in. Voss gripped the back of a chair for balance, his thin frame trembling. "We began with good intentions," he said, "or so we told ourselves. The hollow was failing. The mine was dry. The soil was hard. We had mouths to feed, families to keep safe. Travelers came with coin and no kin nearby. And we told ourselves it was providence, that God himself had sent them to keep us alive." His words fell heavy, like stones sinking through water. "We took what they carried," he continued, "and buried the rest. We built homes, a church, a schoolhouse. We called it progress. We called it survival, but it was murder, and there is no other name for it." He paused then, his eyes closing, as though gathering what strength remained for the part that came next. "But Jacob Whitman," he whispered, voice breaking, "Jacob threatened to reveal us. He was kin to my wife, a decent man, but he couldn't abide what we'd done. He swore he'd ride to Lexington, to the authorities, and bring justice on our heads. We pleaded with him to stay quiet, to think of the children, the women, the work we'd done with the money, but he would not." His voice faltered. The entire room leaned forward. "So we made a choice that damned us forever. We killed him, his wife, their little girls. Mary was heavy with child. Twins," the midwife said. "The babies might have lived had we sought help, but we did not. We put them in the ground like the others, prayed God would forgive us, and built this place higher still on their bones." The chamber fell silent, a silence so deep that even the wind outside seemed to withdraw. Eliza Whitlock's eyes filled with tears, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "They were not alone in the ground," she said softly. Catherine's small hand found her sister's. 4 souls were crying for justice. Catherine added. Judge Grayson removed his spectacles and covered his face with both hands. Sheriff Mercer, a practical man of the frontier, stared at the floorboards as though expecting them to split open. One by one, the other names on the twins' list grew heavy with implication. Miles Davenport, the millwright; Harland Price, former deacon; Samuel Ebbett, the carpenter who had built the very benches on which the congregation sat. Each of them, pale as grave dust, kept their silence, but silence was no longer protection. It was confession by absence. Voss, tears now streaming freely, sank into his chair. His wife, seated in the gallery, buried her face in her hands. Catherine Whitlock broke the next silence with words that would be quoted in court transcripts for years afterward. "You called it survival," she said, voice calm but carrying across the room. "But the Hollow called it murder. You prayed to God while standing on unmarked graves. You took from men who trusted you, and killed those who tried to stop you, and you thought the earth would keep your secret. It did not." Those present reported a physical sensation then, a chill like air sucked through a crack in a crypt. Even Judge Grayson would later write that the words felt not like the thoughts of a child, but like the verdict of something beyond human reach. By late afternoon, the magistrate's gavel struck. Formal charges would be drawn, arrests would be made. A full excavation of the church and mine would begin at dawn. But Sheriff Mercer, though he had spent his career chasing facts, found himself asking a question he had never thought would pass his lips. "How," he said, addressing Jonathan Whitlock with careful respect, "do your girls know what no living soul has spoken in over a decade?" Jonathan's weathered face tightened. He looked at his daughters. They looked back at him. A quiet signal passed among the three. "It's not sight," Jonathan said, "not in the way folks talk of witches or prophets. It's something colder. They dream it. They feel it. Sometimes they wake screaming from places they've never been. My late wife feared it. She said her blood ran close to the old way, that her grandmother spoke to what wasn't there, but what these girls have." He shook his head. "It's like they carry the memory of the dead." Judge Grayson leaned forward. "The dead speak to them." Jonathan paused. "Not words, not like a conversation, more like impressions, faces, names, the moment before a life is cut away, sometimes the moment after, and always the truth." Catherine's small voice cut through the hush. "We don't understand it, Your Honor." "We just know the dead don't like being forgotten." That night Ashford Hollow did not sleep. Families barred their doors, lamps burned late. Some prayed, some packed, some whispered of divine judgment, others of curses too deep for scripture to mend. By dawn, the first of the excavations would begin, and with them, the final stripping away of every lie Ashford Hollow had built to protect itself. But for the Whitlock twins, sleep brought no peace. They dreamed of blood-soaked beams, of gold coins sewn into saddles, of infants who never drew breath crying without sound beneath the cold earth. And when they woke, the screaming did not stop. The unearth. By the morning of March 16, 1834, Ashford Hollow no longer felt like a settlement but a waiting grave. The sky hung low and colorless, a dull pewter dome pressing down on fields still stiff with frost. Men who had spent their lives digging for coal and iron now carried shovels for another purpose, not for fortune, but for reckoning. Sheriff Elias Mercer, flanked by 6 deputies, ordered the first section of the church floor removed just after sunrise. The pews were carried outside, stacked like cordwood against the eastern wall. Planks that had been polished weekly by careful parishioners now groaned as nails were pried loose. By 8 o'clock the Hollow's spiritual heart lay exposed, a pit of packed dirt beneath a house of worship. The first bones appeared within the hour. "Here," called Deputy Allen Rowe, his voice unsteady. He held up what at first looked like the broken limb of a deer. Then the truth registered. A human femur, yellowed and cracked. By mid-morning the excavation had uncovered 4 complete skeletons, the remains of 2 adult men, 1 woman, and a child no more than 5. The positions of the bones told a story no sermon could sanctify. Some had been hastily wrapped in what remained of decayed cloth, others dumped with none at all. Coins, belt buckles and buttons lay scattered like morbid punctuation in the dirt. The church bells, which had tolled every Sunday for 16 years, remained silent. It would have been blasphemy to ring them now. Elder Nathaniel Voss, shackled and seated under armed guard, wept openly as the bodies were raised. "God have mercy," he muttered again and again, as if repetition could bend the past into something less damp. But the Hollow itself seemed eager to testify. At the southern edge of the excavation, Deputy Ruthven struck wood, not coffin wood, but a barrel. When they pried it open, the smell turned grown men pale. Inside were human remains packed with lime, a practice known among old miners as a way to hasten decay. Catherine Whitlock did not speak at first.
though her small body trembled as if catching echoes from beneath the earth. It was Eliza who broke the quiet. "There's more," she whispered, her eyes not on the pit but somewhere distant, somewhere past sight. Sheriff Mercer crouched to her level. "More, child." Eliza nodded. "Below the west wall, 7 steps from the pulpit." Workmen hesitated, not because they doubted her, but because they had already begun to believe her too much. "Do it," Mercer ordered. The men dug where the girl had pointed,
and they found them. 8 bodies. Men, women, a boy with a crushed skull, a woman whose fingers had been severed, likely for the rings she wore. There was no denying it now. Ashford Hollow was not a town touched by murder. It was a town built on it. By evening, 21 sets of remains had been exhumed beneath the church alone. The old mine shaft, barely a quarter-mile west, had yet to be touched. Judge Albert Grayson convened an emergency hearing as lanterns were lit in the courthouse. He sat pale but resolute, a stack of names and dates growing beside him like a ledger written in bone. He called first for Elder Voss. "Sir," the judge said, his voice low but cutting, "you swore before God and man to shepherd this flock, and now we find your pulpit raised over the murdered dead. I will ask you plainly, were these acts sanctioned by you?" Voss lowered his head. "I did not stop them," he said hoarsely. "I profited by them. That is guilt enough." Grayson turned his gaze to Miles Davenport, Harlan Plast, Samuel Ebbett, each of whom stood shackled and silent. "Speak," the judge commanded. "Lies will no longer protect you. The ground itself testifies against you." Davenport cracked first. "It began with hunger," he said, eyes red but unrepentant. "But it turned to habit. Men came through with coin. No kin, no questions. It was easy, easier than work. Price followed, his voice barely above a whisper. We told ourselves they were sinners, gamblers, drunkards, that their deaths cleansed the road of vice. But it was always about the gold." Ebbett said nothing at all. He simply stared at the dirt floor as though already halfway to the gallows. The Whitlock twins sat together near the front, their small hands clasped so tightly that blood had drained from their knuckles. They did not cry. They only watched. It was as though they had carried this burden too long for tears to mean anything now. When the courtroom hushed, Catherine spoke, not to the judge, not to the crowd, but to the accused. "You put them in the ground," she said softly, her voice steady as a preacher's. "But the ground did not keep them. They still walk when you sleep. They still cry when you sin, and they have followed us here, so they can be named." A murmur of fear rippled through the onlookers. One woman crossed herself. Another clutched a rosary until her fingers went white. Judge Grayson, though rattled, maintained his judicial bearing. "We will continue," he said firmly. "These proceedings are now a capital matter. The full force of Kentucky law will fall upon this place. But before verdicts, we must know." He turned back to the girls. "Are there more yet to be found?" Eliza looked at Catherine. Catherine nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," Eliza whispered. "In the shaft, in the water table, and not all of them old." That final phrase chilled even the magistrate. "Not all of them old," he repeated. Catherine's blue eyes met his. "Some were taken after the church was built," she said. "Long after. Some in secret, even from the others. One man kept it going, even when the others were finished." The room erupted. Cries of disbelief, of horror, of denial. Grayson slammed the gavel hard enough to splinter the wood. "Order," he bellowed. The sheriff leaned in. "If what the girls say is true, Your Honor," Mercer said grimly, "we ain't dealing with history anymore. We're dealing with something breathing." And so, under the pale flicker of oil lamps, Judge Grayson issued a new order. The mine shaft would be excavated. The wells would be drained. Every missing traveler reported within 30 miles over the last decade would be matched against what the hollow still held. Ashford Hollow was no longer a town. It was a crime scene the size of a parish, and through it all the Whitlock twins sat silently, faces like porcelain carved from sorrow, listening to voices no one else could hear. At midnight, as the prisoners were led away, Catherine whispered a single sentence that Sheriff Mercer would repeat until his dying day. "It isn't finished." He asked what she meant, but she only looked toward the western ridge. the place where the trail forked toward the old quarry. "The earth isn't done talking," she said. And then for the first time since they'd arrived, both girls began to cry. Not the quiet tears of fear, but the deep racking sobs of children who knew that what waited to be found might make even this day look merciful by comparison. The hollow speaks again. The morning of March 17th, the wind carried a smell of iron and something else. Something wet, sour, unmistakably human from the old shaft that gaped like a black wound west of Ashford Hollow's shuttered church. Lanterns hung from crude posts, their pale halos barely reaching the earth where the diggers worked in grim silence. By sunrise, 50 men had gathered. Not all were willing. Some had to be ordered under penalty of contempt to turn spades into soil that had never been meant to be disturbed. The mine had collapsed years earlier, its timbers rotted, its passages dangerous even when untouched, but Judge Grayson's order carried weight greater than fear. The first descent began just after the bells of St. Mary's struck 7. Sheriff Mercer led the crew, his jaw locked tight. Behind him, 2 deputies and Ezekiel Greer, a miner from Hazard, who knew how to read an unstable shaft, carried coils of rope and canvas sacks for whatever they found. It did not take long. At 30 feet they struck bone, not a skeleton in repose but a scatter, as if someone had dumped a dozen butchered carcasses and fled. Skulls with impact fractures, femurs, snapped mid-shaft, a jaw with teeth worn down to pegs, lime again caked like plaster over ancient sin. They called up for more rope. At 60 feet there were barrels, 3 of them, lashed with rusted iron hoops, each packed with what the old-timers used to call quiet cargo. The air turned heavy. Men vomited into their shirts. One deputy climbed up, white-faced and shaking. "They ain't all bones," he stammered to Judge Grayson, standing at the lip of the shaft. "Some still got shape to 'em. Hair." And then Catherine Whitlock screamed. It wasn't a cry of fear, but of recognition, as though 100 voices had spoken through one frail throat. Her sister clutched her shoulders, but Catherine staggered forward, eyes wide and glassy, as if the shaft itself had dragged her mind downward. "They're angry," she choked. "Not the ones from before, the new ones. They don't understand why they're here. They were promised safety. They were promised the Lord's house would keep them." Judge Grayson crouched, gripping her by the arms, speaking low. "Child who?" Catherine's lips quivered. "2 boys," she whispered, one barely grown, "taken last winter. A girl," she prayed while they cut her. She prayed and they laughed. The courtyard went still. All the hollow's noise, the hammering, the ropes creaking, the scraping of metal in earth, seemed to stop. Eliza spoke next, her voice hollow, like something borrowed. "One man did this after the others stopped," she said. "He watched the first killings. He learned. He waited until no one would suspect. He made them believe the danger had passed." She turned, eyes sweeping the gathered men. "He's here." Murmurs erupted. Sheriff Mercer barked for silence, but panic traveled faster than law. Faces turned suspicious, then terrified. Hands tightened around hat brims, around knife handles, around Bibles like talismans. Judge Grayson stood, his voice rising over the storm of fear. "No man moves until the truth is spoken plain. We will not let mob justice follow blood with more blood." Catherine, still trembling, looked past the crowd, past the church, past the law itself, to where an old man sat on the porch of the blacksmith's house, hands folded like a... By evening the table bore a grim mosaic, fragments sorted by size, cleaned of soil, aligned into rough human silhouettes. Loring wrote notes in a neat, looping hand, assigning letters and numbers like catalog entries in a library of horror. Grayson hovered nearby, eyes heavy. "Will this hold in court?" he asked quietly. Loring paused, then adjusted his spectacles. "If your court is honest, yes. If it is convenient, no. Truth rarely survives convenience." Across the hall, Reverend Caldwell knelt in prayer beside the Whitlock girls. He had tried unsuccessfully to shield them from the dissection room, but the courthouse walls were thin and the smell of spirit-soaked cloth carried everywhere. "Does this trouble you?" he asked them. Catherine looked up, expression unreadable. "It isn't new." Eliza nodded. "We've seen worse. Not with our eyes, she clarified, but worse all the same. Caldwell shut his eyes, whispered a psalm under his breath, then stopped. If this is not of God, he said softly, then heaven forgive us for standing idle, and if it is of God, then I fear what kind of world he has built. The inquiry continued into the night. Loring prepared a crude diagram, 3 bodies annotated with notations like force consistent with heavy timber, and cut marks suggest restraint prior to fatal blow. He requested cloth to wrap the remains. We will need to bury them properly, he said. Science can interrogate, only dignity can conclude. Grayson approved, but with conditions: graves on consecrated ground, witnessed by court and clergy, names etched if known, symbols if not. The following morning, a fresh unease bled through town. Word had spread not of murder, but of method. Men whispered in taverns that bones had been taken apart like hogs. Women fretted that even the righteous dead might be handled like curiosity. Caldwell preached restraint from the courthouse steps, but the words scattered like straw in a windstorm. By afternoon, a small crowd formed at the edge of the square, not angry, not yet, but restless. The faces were drawn, eyes dark from sleepless night. They demanded answers in the language of fear disguised as piety. You dig up our dead, a farmer named Holt said, and the ground's liable to spit back something worse. Or, added another, you stir up what kept quiet out of mercy. Grayson stepped out onto the steps, hat in hand. The dead have spoken, he said, not by choice, but by the weight of the crimes done to them. If you would deny them even this truth, written and witnessed, then you are no better than those who put them under. A murmur rolled through the crowd. No one moved forward, but neither did they disperse. It was Catherine who broke the tension. She appeared at her father's side, eyes pale in the late sun. The dead aren't angry, she said, voice steady. They're relieved. They've waited a long time to be found. Eliza joined her, a half step behind, but the hollow doesn't like losing what it owns. A low ripple of discomfort traveled the group. Several crossed themselves. Holt removed his hat, ran a trembling hand through his hair, then backed away without another word. By sunset the square was empty again. Inside, Loring finished wrapping the remains in clean cloth. He stitched each parcel with rough but careful hands, then set them aside like offering. They should be buried tonight, he said. If your mountain keeps score, don't give it time to collect interest. Mercer and 2 deputies carried the bundles to the churchyard by lantern light. Caldwell led a quiet service, voice breaking only once. He closed the book without a benediction, as though he dared not ask God for more than silence. As the last shovelful of earth thudded onto the graves, Catherine shivered. Cold? Eliza asked. No, Catherine said. Listening. Mercer looked over sharply. Listening for what? For who's next? She replied. The hollow answers. The night after the burials, Ashford Hollow seemed to exhale. Wind slipped between the cabins with a low whistle, as though testing the town's nerve. Horses shifted in their stalls, stamping hooves against frozen earth. Somewhere out on the ridge, a single owl called, then fell silent. Deputy Mercer had taken to sleeping in a chair by the courthouse door. Easier to be where trouble's likely to start, he muttered, though no one had asked. Sheriff Grayson hadn't slept at all. His lamp still burned at 3 in the morning. Ledger books and witness lists spread across his desk like a map of hidden wounds. Caldwell visited just after dawn. He looked older than he had a week earlier. The creases in his face deepened by doubt. I'm not sure we've done the right thing, he admitted quietly. Justice feels like a word we keep trying on like a suit that doesn't fit. Grayson leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. We dig. We name. We testify. What else is there? Caldwell stared at the floorboard. Burying truth doesn't stop its rot, but neither does pulling it up fix what's already poisoned. They both fell silent. In the next room, Catherine and Eliza sat on a wooden bench, their legs dangling like children waiting for school to begin. Though their eyes carried none of a child's ease, Catherine traced invisible lines in the air with her finger, a habit she had when listening to something no one else could hear. Eliza finally broke the silence. They're restless again. Caldwell went rigid. The dead? No, Catherine corrected, still drawing lines. The hollow itself. Sheriff Grayson stepped into the room. Meaning. Eliza looked up. We took something from it. The bones. The names. It's looking for balance. Grayson didn't like that answer. He didn't like any answer that didn't lead to a warrant or a rifle, but there was no denying the rhythm of events in Ashford Hollow felt less like coincidence and more like some old equation working itself out. By mid-morning, Mercer arrived with news that snapped what little calm the town had left. Another one's missing, he announced, breathless from running up the courthouse steps. Thomas Baird, trapper, mid-30s, lives near the South Cut. Wife says he went to check his lines last night. Never came back. Caldwell swore softly. Grayson reached for his hat. Round up a team, the sheriff ordered. Hounds, lanterns, rope. We searched the ridge. Catherine and Eliza exchanged a look. Catherine spoke first. You won't find him. Grayson stopped halfway to the door. Meaning? He's not on the ridge anymore, Eliza said. Voice flat. The hollow took him underneath. The search went on anyway. It had to. 12 men combed the South Cut, following faint prints, finding nothing. Hounds barked at empty air, then whined and backed away from a low seam in the rock where the trail seemed to vanish. Mercer lit a lantern and crouched, peering inside. Cave, he muttered. Narrow, but it runs deep. Grayson crouched beside him, shoulders brushing limestone damp with cold water. The air that came out smelled of rust and earth, and something faintly sour. Lanterns up, Grayson ordered. We're going in. The cave swallowed sound as efficiently as it swallowed light. The deeper they went, the quieter it got, until even their own footsteps seemed ashamed to echo. 30 yards in, Mercer Sir, he whispered, though there was no one to overhear. Hear that? At first it sounded like water, slow, rhythmic dripping. Then, as their ears adjusted, it resolved into something else entirely. A low, steady hum, almost like a choir heard through wall. Grayson raised his lantern. The light caught bone. A rib cage, half buried in silt. A skull wedged between rocks, jaw locked wide as if frozen mid-scream. Beside it lay a bundle of cloth rotted into threads, still knotted at what might once have been ripped. They found Thomas Baird further in, kneeling upright in a shallow recess. Eyes wide, skin drained of color but unmarked. He looked like a man who had died of terror with no wound to show for it. Mercer gagged. 2 deputies crossed themselves. Grayson stood very still, lantern trembling just enough to make shadows crawl like living things. Bag him, he said finally, voice hoarse. We're not leaving anyone here. The trip back to daylight felt longer than the descent. Men stumbled over stones they hadn't noticed before. One tripped and tore his palm on a shard of something that wasn't rock. When he looked, it was a femur smooth as river stone. By the time they reached open air, noon's sun felt like a benediction no sermon could match. Baird's wife collapsed when she saw him. No wound, no blood, just a man returned to her, stiff and cold, eyes still open, pupils blown wide like someone staring straight into judgment. That night, the town didn't sleep. Caldwell held an emergency service in the square. Half the town came with candles. The other half locked their doors and prayed into their pillows. Grayson addressed the crowd, voice hard. This isn't hysteria. We've got bodies, ledgers, witnesses. Men in this town killed, and they hid it here. Whatever's happening now, he stopped, searching the crowd, is what happens when you build a home over a grave and call it blessed. A murmur rippled through the gathered, fear battling shame in equal measure. Then Catherine stepped forward, a candle in her hand. Its flame barely reached her chin, but her presence commanded silence like a judge entering a chamber. It's not done, she said simply. Eliza joined her. Not until all of it is seen. Every name, every lie, every hand that profited from what was buried. Someone in the crowd shouted, and then what? What fixes this? Eliza's reply was calm and cruel in its honesty. Nothing. You don't fix a wound like this. You clean it. You let it scar. Caldwell closed his eyes. Grayson removed his hand. The square stayed silent long enough for the hollow to answer with a groan that rolled through the ground like distant thunder. It wasn't loud. It was worse. Soft. Almost polite. Like something very old clearing its throat before speaking. And then the candles all went out. The confession of Ashford Hollow. The square erupted in screams. Mothers pulled children to their skirts. Men stumbled into one another, the sudden dark making every shape monstrous. The church bell began to toll without a hand on its rope.
not frantic but measured, as though some unseen sacristan marked a funeral no living man had authorized. Grayson barked orders. Lanterns. Light them. Deputies fumbled with flint. Sparks. Little circles of light reappeared, timid against the suffocating night. The twins stood still, hands clasped, their candle stub cold and black. Caldwell knelt beside them. Are you doing this? Eliza shook her head. Catherine whispered, this is them. Grayson demanded. All of them. Eliza answered. Everyone you've woken. The bell stopped. The silence that followed was not silence at all. It was a layered hush, thick, like 100 breaths held in unison. The temperature fell. Men's exhalations fogged the air like pipe smoke. Then came the sound of wood splintering. Every head turned toward the courthouse. Its front doors buckled outward as though struck from within. One hinge tore free with a slow metallic scream. The building exhaled dust, and from that wound in its frame came a smell no one who survived would ever forget. Copper, damp earth, and the bitter tang of something old and wrong. Caldwell whispered a prayer, half memory, half plea. Sheriff Grayson pushed forward, rifle drawn, deputies at his side. Stay behind me. They stepped inside. The main chamber was empty. The ledgers lay scattered like leaves. The judge's chair sat upright untouched, but along the walls in places no light should have reached. Water streaked down in thin dark lines like veins weeping. Sheriff Mercer said softly, pointing. Names had appeared on the plaster, not carved, not painted, simply there, raised as though the wall itself had chosen to remember. Some were names already known, others entirely new. At the bottom, a phrase no one in that room would dare speak aloud, though each read it. Ashford, hollow built on blood. Grayson lowered his rifle. This is confession, Catherine said, her voice suddenly so loud it startled the room. Not yours. The Hollow's. Caldwell's mouth went dry. God have mercy. Outside, the gathered townsfolk began to shout. Grayson and his men rushed to the window. The earth at the edge of the square, a patch of frost-stiff grass near the livery stable, was sinking, like bread dough punched by an invisible fist. Boards cracked. A shallow pit opened. From it rose not bodies, not bones, but the artifacts of years of silent theft. Coins black with tarnish, buckles, buttons, the gleam of pocket watches. Evidence the guilty had never planned to surrender now surfaced like offerings to a furious god. No one approached. The twins walked forward, unafraid, bare feet whispering on the cold boards. They stood at the lip of the pit, and looked down like children staring into a dry well. Is it enough? Eliza asked. The ground shivered. No, Catherine answered herself. It wants the living. Gasped. Someone cried out. Take who? The girls did not look up.
Those who fed the Hollow, Eliza said. Those who kept the lie alive. Not only the hands that struck the blow, but the ones that washed them clean. Grayson turned, sweeping the crowd with eyes like a noose tightening. Caldwell's heart slammed against his ribs. He had baptized the children of some of those men. He had eaten at their tables. He had blessed their minds. And now he understood that blessing had been salt on a grave. One by one, the names on the courthouse walls began to fade. Not vanish but blur, as though smeared by invisible fingers. 4 remained sharp, gleaming wet in the lantern light. Mercer read them aloud, his voice cracking. Edward Hale, Nathan Proctor, Elias Wayne, Robert Lee. A murmur ran through the square. These were not the oldest among them. They were mid-aged, strong, men who had prospered quietly under the previous generation's sins, men who had built new rooms on old rot. The ground at the pit's edge cracked again. A smell like rain on iron drifted up. The 4 named men began to shake their heads, to deny, to plead. Please, Hale begged. I inherited nothing but trouble. I never touched a soul. But Catherine spoke with a voice that did not belong to a child. The Hollow keeps no contracts, she said. It remembers debts, not excuses. Something in the pit moved, not visibly but with sound. A wet, deliberate shift like something rolling beneath loose stones. Hale fell to his knees, clutching at the hem of Caldwell's coat. The pastor recoiled as though burned. Grayson drew his pistol. It shook in his hand. Stop this, he barked at the twins, though his voice held no authority now, only fear. Your children, you can stop this. Eliza looked at him with pity, not power. We didn't start it. From the hollow came a noise none could later describe. Some said wind, some said water, others swore it was laughter, and the four men were yanked, as if by the ankles, straight down into the earth, not fast, not violently, just steadily, like sand swallowing a post. They didn't scream at first. They were too shocked. When the screaming came, it lasted too long. By the time silence returned, the pit was flat again, grass and frost undisturbed, as if no one had ever stood there at all. Caldwell fell to his knee. Grayson holstered his pistol with hands that no longer obeyed him. Mercer wept openly, shaking like a man who had stared at God and found no mercy in his face. Eliza looked up finally, scanning the crowd. "It's quieter now," she said softly. Catherine added, "But not silent." Caldwell closed his eyes and whispered, "Dear Lord, what will it take?" Eliza's answer chilled every man present. Everything. The hollow's price. Ashford Hollow did not sleep. Doors remained barred, shutters latched, lamps burned through the night like beacons on a doomed shore. No one trusted the silence. No one trusted the ground. By morning, frost lay thick across the square, a pale shroud over a town that had run out of tears. The courthouse bell hung crooked, its rope frayed to a single stubborn thread. The pit where the four men had been taken looked like any other patch of frozen grass, as though the earth itself refused to keep a scar. Grayson gathered the remaining elders at the church. Caldwell, Mercer, two councilmen too frightened to refuse. The twins sat in the first pew, still as carved saints, eyes not on the men but on something only they could see. Grayson's voice was ragged. "We have to decide. If we stay, we live on top of a graveyard that eats the guilty. If we leave, we abandon everything we've built." Mercer shook his head. "It won't matter. The hollow isn't about staying or going. It's about owing." Caldwell stared at the floorboards. "Debts like this don't forgive. They consume until balance is reached." Grayson slammed his palm against the table. "Then what's left? Sacrifice? Prayer? A gallows in the square? Tell me how to pay the hollow so it lets us be." No one spoke. Eliza finally broke the silence. "It won't take more blood." Every head turned. Catherine finished her sister's thought. "But it will take everything built on the old." Councilman Ward swallowed. "You mean the homes, the church, the mine, the coin in your pockets, the boards in these walls?" Eliza said. "Every nail driven with a hand that profited from what was buried must be removed." Catherine looked up, her expression almost kind. "Ashford Hollow must be unmade." The men stared, uncomprehending. Caldwell understood first. He exhaled like a man sentenced. "They mean the town itself." Grayson leaned back, the chair creaking like a coffin lid. "You're saying to tear down every building, scatter every beam, salt the ground?" Eliza nodded. Mercer muttered, "Madness." But no one could argue, not after what they'd seen, not after the earth itself had claimed names like a judge reading a verdict. By noon, word had spread. Families gathered in the square, clutching children, heirlooms, livestock. Arguments broke out, then died in throats as the twins walked among them like pale judges. They offered no threats. They made no demand. They simply looked, one child to a man, a woman a house, and nodded or shook their heads with terrifying finality. Whatever passed between them and the hollow required no language anyone else could decipher. The town began to take itself apart. The church was the first to fall. Men removed the cross, dismantled the altar, pried up boards one by one and carried them to the edge of the ridge, where they burned them in silence. Smoke curled into a pale winter sky like a prayer. The wind refused to carry. The mine was lanterns went dark, beams pulled, carts overturned and hurled into the black. Some wept as they worked, others labored with grim relief, as if tearing down the place of their livelihood also tore out the root of their shame. By nightfall, Ashford Hollow looked less like a town and more like a scavenged ruin. Homes stood gutted, fences collapsed, doors stacked like corpses waiting for burial. The air itself seemed to lighten, though no one dared call it safe. Caldwell stood with Grayson at the edge of what had been the square. The twins sat on a cart nearby, leaning against each other, eyes closed as though listening to a lullaby only they could hear. "Is it enough?" Grayson asked them finally, his voice a rasp. Eliza opened her eyes, almost. Catherine pointed to the courthouse, the only building left standing. Grayson cursed under his breath. Of course, the men worked by torchlight, pulling down rafters, tossing ledgers into the fire.
smashing windows like penitents striking their own back. When the final beam fell, a sound rolled through the hollow, low, deep, almost a sigh. The twins stood. "It's done," Eliza said. Catherine added, "The hollow is quiet." No one cheered. No one prayed. The crowd simply stood among the remains of their lives, numb, broken, strangely relieved. Caldwell wiped his face with trembling hands. "What now?" Eliza looked at her sister. Catherine nodded. "You leave," Eliza said. "Scatter. Don't build here again. Don't speak its name where children can hear it." Caldwell swallowed hard. "And you?" The twins exchanged another glance, and for the first time since they'd arrived, something like weariness crept across their faces. "We keep listening," Catherine said soft. "There are other hollows." The pastor sank to the ground, face in his hands. Grayson turned away, muttering curses, too tired to carry heat. Mercer leaned against the wheel of a cart, staring at the skeletal remains of a town that had devoured itself. By morning, Ashford Hollow was a caravan, wagons loaded, animals tethered, families moving like refugees from a war fought not with armies but with memory. They did not speak as they left. They only looked back once, each expecting, though none would admit, to see the earth swallow the last of the ruins like a meal finished at last. But the ridge held still. The hollow slept. For now, the echo that remains. The exodus from Ashford Hollow stretched 3 days. Carts rattled over frozen ground. Horses stumbled on ruts, gouged deep by decades of use. And no one spoke above a whisper. Children asked questions, but parents shushed them with eyes like cracked glass. By the time they reached the county line, the town was a ghost twice over, its houses dismantled, its name unwelcome even in prayer. Grayson rode at the head of the caravan, but he no longer carried the posture of a man in charge. He rode like a pallbearer, upright by duty, hollowed by the weight on his shoulders. Caldwell followed close, eyes distant, lips moving in silent apology to God or to the dirt, perhaps both. The twins sat together on a wagon piled with salvaged grain and blankets. They held hands but did not speak. Their eyes were open, though they seemed to see nothing that anyone else could. They didn't flinch when a wheel snapped on a frost-heaved ridge, didn't stir when a babe wailed for milk. They were listening still, always listening. On the 4th day, a council formed out of exhausted necessity. Families needed new homes, decisions about land, food, safety. They gathered in the lee of a ruined barn outside Miller's Creek, the nearest settlement willing to even host them. Grayson addressed them without stand. "We build again," he said, "but we build without lies this time. No blood to pay for wood, no graves in the ground before we lay our own names down." Mercer scoffed. "As if sin listens to our promises." Caldwell spoke softly, like a man begging a favor from the wind. "No more hollows, no more digging where things should stay buried. If the land remembers, then we must learn to forget." The meeting ended without decision. A few families left that very night, taking wagons west. Others lingered, afraid to move too far, afraid not to move at all. And the twins, who had been silent through it all, finally spoke again at dawn. Eliza stood first. Her hair hung in dark braids, her face pale with some inner exhaustion no sleep could cure. "It's quiet now," she said. Catherine looked up, her voice barely a thread, but not empty. Grayson stiffened. "What do you mean?" Eliza blinked slowly, as if translating thoughts that came from too far away. "It's not the hollow that's hungry. It never was. It's what was woken inside it. We quieted it by pulling down what it fed on." Catherine's eyes welled, though no tears fell, but some of it came with us. The gathering went still. "Is it inside you?" Caldwell asked, though his voice trembled like he already knew the answer. "No," Eliza said. Catherine shook her head, finishing her sister's thought. "Not just us." A silence grew so deep that even the wind seemed to step around it. "Then where?" Mercer asked finally, his words low, brittle, scared. The twins turned their heads toward the wagons, toward the people huddled under quilts, toward the innocents sleeping, toward the guilty trying to forget. "Everywhere it was carried," Eliza said. Catherine added, "Everywhere the boards went, the nails, the coin, the soil clinging to wagon wheels. It clings to memory, not place." Grayson cursed under his breath, stood, walked away into the cold. Mercer looked ready to vomit. Caldwell sat down hard on a half-rotted beam, hands gripping his knees until the knuckles blanched white. "This isn't an end," Catherine whispered. Eliza closed her eyes. "No, only a pause." By winter's thaw, the caravan had scattered. Some built new homes in distant valleys. Others went east, toward rivers and trade. A few wandered, rootless, too haunted to set. Ashford Hollow itself remained a wound in the map, an unnamed gap on county records, a caution traded in taverns: don't camp near the old ridge, don't dig where the ground sounds hollow. But the quiet didn't last. First came the disappearances: a trapper gone west of Miller's Creek, a blacksmith's apprentice vanished on a delivery run. Then came the whispers that their wives heard knocking beneath floorboards at night, that infants woke screaming without breath, that livestock balked at doorframes made from salvaged beams. By spring, a woman was found half buried in soil no one remembered dig, her mouth packed with coins older than the county itself, and still the law could prove nothing. Grayson died that summer, slumped against a well, eyes wide and fixed on something no one else could see. Mercer vanished. 2 weeks later, his horse returned riderless, reins snapped, saddle empty. Caldwell left a letter and walked into the woods, never to return. The twins passed quietly from town to town, still listening. Sometimes they warned, sometimes they simply left, saying nothing but leaving rooms colder than before. By the 1840s, their names no longer appeared on any register. Whether they died, disappeared, or were simply forgotten, history does not say. But in quiet corners of Kentucky, in churches built too quickly on too much borrowed lumber, people still tell the story of twin girls who saw what no child should, of a town that fed on blood and built a hollow too deep to fill, of debts that don't sleep, only wait. Some nights, travelers report voices in the timber, soft, childlike, speaking names they shouldn't know. Others claim to dream of a town they've never seen, of a mind that breathes, of a church whose cross leans like a broken limb. The map shows no Ashford Hollow now, but the roads still curve around an empty ridge, and locals still cross themselves when the wind moans in the valley after dark, because some places never forgive, and some debts never stop collecting.